Yeah, I'm not sure why it does that sometimes. All right, so welcome to week 6, day 4. We're going to get into advanced DOM manipulation. With advanced DOM manipulation, this might feel a little bit more fast-paced because we're getting a little bit more complex. So I went ahead and got my starter code going. I created my index.html. I put my script in there. I got just a header in here for some content. And in my script, I have my proof of life. Let me make sure that that's showing up in my inspect. I do see that. I got some other stuff going on here. It's probably my extensions, or I'm missing my favicon still. I never use that favicon. All right. So let me make this a little bit larger too. So the DOM manipulation, this kind of goes back to, I believe it was day 1 of this week, where we talked about the query selector, the get element by ID. We're going to be getting back into that some more, but we're going to use some more advanced techniques and get some more practice with this. This is kind of the bread and butter of front-end JavaScript. This is what gives you the power over your pages, your applications. It's what makes things dynamic. So this is the kind of stuff you would want to include whenever you're actually building web applications. I'm going to remove this console.log for now. And I'm just going to add a little bit more content to my index.html so I have something to work with. I'm going to create a UL and a couple of LIs. And we'll do list item 1, just so we have some content in this. List item 2. And again, I just need some content to select whenever I actually start creating my JavaScript. It might be a little confusing since I haven't shown you what like my overall goal is. I don't really have an overall goal for the web page. I'm just kind of showing you some snippets of some workflows you would use while you're actually building this stuff out. I'm going to create a div that contains my main content. I'm going to give it an ID of main content. And I'll put that there. And I'll just put in some text so we can see that show up. I'll be latching onto this and actually adding content into this through JavaScript as we go. Let me actually put this in a paragraph element. So this is a block. There we go. And I'm also going to create a few buttons. We'll see what these are used for in a bit. I'm just going to do this ahead of time so that they're here. We'll do 3 buttons. Actually, I'm going to give these a class of btn as well. And we'll create 3 of those. And then I want to give these a little bit of content just so we can actually see them on the screen. If you don't put anything in between your buttons, they're hard to see. Not sure why my formatter is being weird right now. I might have put something in the wrong spot. Looks like I did. There we go. Okay, we got 3 buttons, each with a class of btn. And that should be it for the HTML content. That gives me something to just kind of latch onto and work with here, just a little bit of content on my page. So with that, I'm going to go into my script file, and I'm going to talk about a event listener that I haven't discussed yet. This one is an optional one. I see this a lot. It can prevent a bug that most people don't even realize they have. Sometimes when you load your page, it doesn't load properly. You press refresh and then everything works correctly. And this little snippet will fix that. Typically, you'll encapsulate your entire application with this. So what you would do is you say document dot add event listener. And notice I'm putting this directly on my document. I'm not putting this on any specific element. So this is going on the DOM. It's going on the window. It's going at the most top level that there is. And the event we're waiting for is DOM content loaded. And all this is going to do is say load the page before you do any JavaScript. make sure that the DOM was generated. And remember, the DOM is all of that stuff whenever you inspect the page. Let me go to the browser real quick. All of this is the DOM in these elements here. So this head, this HTML, this body, all of this needs to be loaded prior to using selectors. Sometimes whenever you're trying to select something, like I can select my header. Let me do that real quick. But if the header wasn't loaded into the page yet, then it can't be selected because it doesn't exist yet. So you want to make sure the page is entirely loaded before running your query selectors and get elements by ID and all those sort of things. Because if there's nothing to select, this will return null. It'll throw an error within your JavaScript. Did I spell something wrong? I forgot my equal sign. So the header, we're using query selector, and we're just passing in the element name header. And so that's going to select an element that matches header, and it'll select the first one that it finds. Since I only have one header, it'll grab this one right here. So we have the header selected, and I'll just console.log that out and just kind of remind you what that looks like. Put a little flag here so we can see which line is being console logged. When you have a whole lot of console logs, this stuff can get really confusing. And let's take a look at that. Document.query selector. I spelled selector wrong. So it's saying that that's not a function. Let's do a typo. That should solve it. There we go. And here is the element. Notice this looks like regular HTML. Before I selected an empty div and it showed me some like CSS type of selector. Another time I selected something and it showed me all kinds of items listed in an object. It's all the same thing. This is an object. I can access all of the attributes. It's just the way the browser behaves. It sometimes gives you different results depending on what you select. If I were to select a div, just an empty div on my page, it would give me a completely different result. But it's the exact same content, even though it looks different. So just keep that in mind with your console.log. Whenever you're dealing with the DOM, it can respond a little weird sometimes. So this is the main thing I just wanted to cover here. First thing is this DOM content selector. And again, what people will do is they'll actually push this way down so they don't even have to think about the closing tag. They'll have their prettier turned off for that, or they'll disable that one line. And they'll just do all of their code right here. They won't even think about it. That way, whenever the page finally loads, that's whenever this will happen. And it's not necessary to do this. It's just one of those things where it does give you a little bit of an edge over maybe a developer that isn't using this, because occasionally their web page might not load correctly. And then you press refresh and then it loads correctly the next time, just because it'll load off of the cache on the second load. And then you'll never see the issue again. So I'm just kind of showing you to fix to a bug that you might not even realize that you'll have eventually, just so you know it exists. And it is semi-important to know. Again, it's one of those things where you might impress an interviewer using this. If you have to do like some sort of live coding, you pop this in there and it just is like, hey, look what I'm doing. It'll give you that little bit of a knowledge factor ahead of maybe another candidate. All right, so next I want to talk about, we use query selector here to grab one element. One thing we haven't really covered, I briefly mentioned it, but it's called query selector all. You might have seen it come up in my autocomplete. If I wanted to grab all of these LIs, I'm actually add a couple more here. I'll do 3 and 4. I can use query selector all and grab all of these at once, even though I didn't put a class name on them. And where this might be useful is if I'm dynamically generating these LIs. And we're actually going to generate LIs in a bit here. I'm actually going to code outside of this, just so I'm not confusing myself with curly brackets and parentheses. Sometimes that can get a little bit messy. So let me select all of my LIs. I'll just call this list items for my variable. You can call these variables whatever you want. Sometimes I see people just say LIs, like LIS. It doesn't matter what you call it, just as long as you know what it is and it's somewhat readable. So we're going to use query selector all. And query selector all, it returns what's called a node tree. It's basically an array. Whenever you're using this, it'll behave like an array. It looks like an array. Just consider it an array because it works the same way. You can loop over it. You can iterate over it. Let me go ahead and console log that out, and we'll see what that looks like. We've got list items. List items. I forgot my comma. Want to make sure we separate those with a comma or concatenation if you prefer. Okay, so the list items, again, you can see this looks like an array, but whenever you look at the beginning of this here, this is actually the data type. If this were an array, this would actually say the word array here. Also, you can tell it's not an array because the prototype, it doesn't have all of the prototype methods that an array has, but for the most part, it'll work the same way. It'll do the same thing. We can see we do have the for each method. If we wanted to loop over it with for each, we can do that. I typically prefer to use a classic for loop whenever I'm dealing with the DOM. We could convert this to an actual array. There's a method for that. I believe it is array dot. I'll have to look it up. I can't remember off the top of my head what it is. Array dot from. Yeah, let me see. We'll look on Stack Overflow. There's a few different ones. Here it is, array.from. So you just pass in your node list with the array.from, and then you have every single array method that you want. I'd never use this. It's just one of those things where if you're trying to do some niche things, such as string methods or some maybe the reduce method, since that doesn't exist, anything like that, then you would have to convert this to an array. Again, I've never used that before. I've seen it in documentation from time to time. It's not the most common one to use, but I just wanted to let you know it does exist because this isn't a real array, but it's close enough that we can work with it. Does anyone have any questions about that? And again, I'll show that console.log there. This looks a lot like an array. We have the 0, 1, 2, 3 item numbers. We have a length property on it, and we have a few of the same prototype methods that are on an actual array. And these are actually what we're selecting here. So that's the query selector all. It's a very useful way to get all of your list items without having to individually select each one, especially when you don't know how many there's going to be, because it could change as you add more. Let me go ahead and loop over these. I'm going to create a regular for loop. So a little review on that. Remember, this has 3 parts. We have our initializer. We're going to start our count at 0. And I want to do I less than list items.length. And for the third part, we're going to iterate it by 1 at a time. I'm going to put my code block in. And what I want to do is I'm just going to add an event listener to all of my list items. And on that event listener, I'm actually going to make it so I change the background color of each list item. So when I click on them, I can change the background color to something else. It's kind of like a highlight. So we'll do list items at I. So list items at I is going to select the first list item on the first iteration, and then it will select the second one and then the third one. Because we're directly selecting the items now, I'm able to use my add event listener here. So I'm looping over this and I'm adding event listeners to each item at the same time. So that's pretty cool. And for my callback function, remember my second parameter in the add event listener is a callback function. I'm going to use the arrow function because that is the most common thing you will see whenever you're using this method. So I just want you to be comfortable with this because this is the industry standard for callback functions. So there's my arrow function as my second parameter. And within this callback function, we're going to change list items at I. Again, I'm selecting each item. These are going to be the same item here. And I'm going to do an inline style with this one. We'll change the background color. And let's try black. I want to see if that'll actually apply. Sometimes it doesn't work right because of the black color. Sometimes it'll actually contrast correctly, sometimes not. So let's see what happens. Let's go to the page. I'm going to click on one. And yeah, we basically get a hidden message whenever I click on it now. Not every browser will behave like this, though. Some browsers will actually change this to a better contrast automatically, even when you don't tell it to. It'll actually change the font color. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Everything seemed to be working there, though. I was able to put a event listener on each of my items by looping over this node list and then selecting each item using indexing and then using the .add event listener method with that callback function, including an inline style. And just to show that code there again, we're looping over the items, we're adding the event listener, and then we're accessing the style attribute. And then within that style attribute, we're adding a background color property, and then we're assigning that to black. So this might be a little weird to look at, but anytime you access dot on an element, you're accessing an attribute within that element. And what I mean by that is I could add a style attribute here. I could say background color, and I could say blue. And whenever you look at the JavaScript, it's actually, let me do a split screen here so we can see these side by side. Oh, I got these on the wrong ends. Let's try that again. There we go. And I'll close that so we got a little more room. All right, so I got these side by side so we can see. So we got style here. I'm accessing the style attribute, and then I'm accessing the background color property within that style attribute, and then I'm assigning the color to the value of that key value pair there. So that's how that works. Anytime you use a dot on an element, it's going to access whatever attribute you want. So remember, you can have so many different attributes on here. You can have the class attribute, you have the ID attribute, you can have the for attribute. Any one of those you're accessing through the dot notation, you can access the same in your HTML like that. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, for readability, I'm actually going to remove the multi-split screen here. And we'll go back to the demo. Okay, so I have a main element in my HTML. Where'd that go? This main content. It's not a main element, it's a div. I could make that a main. I'm choosing to use div just so it's generic. I'm going to go ahead and select that. And I'm going to select it with get element by ID, just so we can see that again. I'm going to call this main content. Again, you can call these whatever you want. You could just call it main if you wanted to, main C, main cont. I'm calling mine main content, so it's readable, equals document dot get element by ID. And remember, get element by ID takes in a string that is the direct ID of the element. This is a little bit different than query selector. I'll show you the difference here in a bit. But with query selector, you actually use the CSS selector. With get element by ID, you're passing in the ID name by itself. So actually, I'll do it one more time underneath of here. We'll call this one main C. It's going to be the same thing. I'm going to get the same item. Document dot query selector. And for query selector, to get that by ID, we put in a hashtag. And then main content, I think, is the ID name. Yeah. So there's the difference between these two, but they do the exact same thing. Does anyone have any questions about that? This is a newer way to do it. One thing to note too is this is selecting a node. This is selecting an HTML collection. I'll show the difference whenever I do the class names, actually I'll do the class names now. Let me go ahead and delete this. We're going to use this later. I'm just going to leave it there for now. It's in my global scope, so I'll have access to it. I'll mention that again whenever I get to where I'm actually accessing this main content. So I have those buttons in my HTML. I'm going to select all 3 buttons at the same time. I'm going to select them by their class name. And this is just to show you the get elements by class name method. It's not a method I ever use, but I want to show you what it does, and I'll explain why I don't like it. It's fine for some things, just because it makes these read-only, so you're not able to modify them. So it's get elements by class name. I'm actually going to make this autocomplete so I make sure I don't have any typos. Get element by class name. And then you just pass in the class name. Remember, I gave these all a class of BTN, so that's why I passed in BTN there. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. We're going to see the data type on these is a little bit different. I'm going to go to my browser. Let me do a refresh on that. Okay, there we go. So here it is. We have this HTML collection. It looks like an array, and it works a lot like an array still. But notice we don't have the loop that we had on the query selector. We can't use a for each loop on this. You can only use a for loop. So anytime I'm using this, I end up converting this to a regular array. And because I don't use this very often, or pretty much not at all, I end up not using the converting to an array now at all. So if I were to use it, though, that's what I would end up doing immediately, just because this is all you get. You get the item, you get the length, and if you have a name on it, you get that as well. But you don't get very much. Again, these are read-only, so you can't modify the elements. But where this is useful is these will update instantly. So anywhere in your application, you're using an HTML collection. If you were to add another button, because of the way this works, it's going to actually add that button live. It'll do it in real time. You won't have to rerun your script in order to get that update. It won't do that when you convert it to an array. And that's a very niche use case because you can't really modify them. All you can do is read them. So that would be more for a data collection type of use rather than a data modification type of use. So I just want to show you it exists. If you see it pop up in your autocomplete, that's what it is. Probably just use query selector all instead. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this to buttons 2, just so I don't accidentally use it later. And then I'm going to create another one, const. I'm actually going to go above my console.log. Buttons again equals document.query selector all. And we're just going to grab the same thing. But instead of grabbing this by the class name, which I could say .btn, I'm just going to grab it by the element name. So to do that, we just say button. Either way works. The reason I'm passing in just the element name is just to remind you that you can. Almost always I see query selector all paired with a class like this. And so I just wanted to remind or show you that you can grab all of these by elements. And with that, you could do the same thing here. I'll make another variable. This will be a buttons 3 equals document dot get element by, what was it? Get element by name? No. There is one more. I think maybe it is by tag name. That's what it is. So get element by tag name would do the same thing as this, except it would give you a HTML collection again instead of the node list. So let's take a look at our console.log now that I changed this over to a query selector all. And now we can see we have a node list again. So within our prototype, we get our for each. We have even the entries function, which is pretty nice too. I use that occasionally for getting each item out of there. You could also just convert this to an array if you needed to. I typically just use a for loop though, and I'll iterate over my items. And I'll make sure that I'm doing whatever I need to change through the node list. All right, so I'm actually going to add a event listener to my button here. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make it so when I click this button, it creates another LI. Keep in mind though, when I create a new LI, this is happening after my previous for loop, so it's not going to have this event listener where it'll add the black background. But it'll still add the LI. I could add that if I wanted to now, whenever I loop over it and create the item and all that. Maybe I'll do that too, just so it's more complete. So what I can do here is I'm just going to console.log this. I'm going to say buttons at 0. And just to show you what this element looks like whenever we're indexing it. And here it is here. We can see the button element is selected. So we can access any of the attributes. We can add our event listener to that. So I'm going to remove the console.log now. I just wanted to show you that we are getting the button by indexing it. And now I'm going to add an event listener to it. And again, we're going to use the click event. We should be getting pretty familiar with this one by now. And the first parameter is a string that says click. The second parameter is our callback function. Again, I'm using an arrow function, so I put my parentheses. The parentheses indicates any parameters I wanted to call into my function, such as the event parameter. I'll do that later. I'm not going to add any parameters at the moment. And then I put my code block. And then I like to open this up and make it multiple lines. So whenever I click the button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my UL. The UL is the parent item of the LIs. I'll show that in the HTML once I get this built. So there's my UL being selected, and it's selecting this UL right here. So it's going to scan the document, it's going to find the UL, and it's going to allow me to access it. So that'll be the container that I'm using to append my new LIs when I create them. So let's go ahead and create an LI. LI equals document dot create element. So create element will create something on the DOM, but it doesn't append it to the DOM. It just makes the element in your JavaScript file. So once it's created, we need to actually add it to the document by doing ul.append child, and then we can pass in, not a string. We actually need to pass in this variable because we're passing in the entire element. And before I append, this is where I like to modify my items. You don't have to do it here. You can do it underneath. I do see some people will say li dot enter text. They'll do this on this line. It works fine. I just like to do things in the order that they're happening in. So I'm creating the item, I'm modifying the item, and then I'm adding the item to the document in that order. It's not a requirement. It's just one of those things that I like to do. So let's just do list. We'll call it new list item. So every time I click this button, what I'm expecting to happen is it's going to create an LI. It's going to give it some text, and then it's going to append it to my UL. So let's see if it works. Click button 1, and there's my new list item. And again, I click on this. I don't get the black background. That's because my for loop is happening way up here. This happens before the click happens. So once this runs, it doesn't run again unless I tell it to. I could put this into a function, reselect everything, and then reapply all of my background colors. Something else I could do would be just to grab my LI and give it an event listener here. So I could say li dot add event listener. And then honestly, I can just copy and paste all of this because it's the same. just like that, except for this I. This is just li.style. So a little bit of an extra piece there. It does kind of make this look a little more complicated, but it does work. So we'll make sure it works first off. Click, click, and there we get our black background. So I did just repeat some code. This would be better as a function, and then I would just invoke my function instead of repeating all of this. But again, I just wanted to demonstrate that this happens first. It doesn't happen again. So if you do run into an issue like that, you may have to create another event listener and modify your items like that. You'll probably eventually run into that bug, and it might take you a minute to remember, but hopefully you'll realize that this is happening in top level. So it's only going to run once, or it'll run as many LIs are on the page at the time the page loads. Which these don't exist on page load, so it doesn't add that event listener. So again, we're adding that manually inside of the time of creation. Any questions yet? Is everyone following so far? I'm not going too fast or anything. Alrighty, I'm going to select my other button now. So to select this button, I use the index at 0. Remember, this is a node list. It looks a lot like an array. Just for the sake of argument, I'm going to call it an array. So we have this array of buttons, and we're grabbing the first element with the 0 here. So I'm going to grab the second element by using buttons at 1, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to say add event listener. It's going to be another click listener. And we're going to put our callback function. So I need parameters, arrow, code block. And what I want to do is make it so I can remove the last list item in my list. And to do that, we have to use a method. I'll show you the method on MDM. But in order to let's talk about how to get the last list item. There's a couple ways we can do this. We could say, I could create a variable here and say index to be removed. I know it's a really long variable name, but it's very specific and understood when it's read. And this would be equal to, we could say list items at -1. This is one option. This will return the last item in our list items array. Except the list items isn't technically an array, so I don't think I get the at method. So I'm actually going to do this using indexing. We do get the length property. So we can say take the length -1, and this will give us the last index item. So index to be removed is going to be stored there. Now let me go to MDN, and I'm actually going to show you how to find this because this isn't a very common thing to do like this. So you may forget this eventually. I just want to show you how you would find the solution for this. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do a quick Google search, how to remove an item from the DOM in JavaScript. So right away we get this use element.remove to remove from the DOM. This is our top result. Here's an MDN documentation. One thing I want you to be aware of is if I didn't say in JavaScript here, you might get some results about jQuery. If you see something relating to jQuery, right here we got one. In this case, the .remove method is the same, but make sure you avoid anything that mentions jQuery because we don't use jQuery. We don't teach jQuery. It's a dying tool. I mean, it's still, you might run into it if you're working in an old code base. If you're really familiar and really comfortable with this standard type of DOM manipulation right here, you could learn jQuery in a few hours just by referencing documentation, watching a couple YouTube videos. It does all of this stuff, but it does it in really shorthand and shortcut type of ways using like a $sign. To grab all of this stuff, you just put like a $sign and then it just selects everything. It's really slick. But again, it's no longer being used. It's being replaced by front-end frameworks such as React, Angular. There's so many other ones out there that jQuery is kind of dying off. Also, a lot of the things it did, vanilla JavaScript added into the language. For example, query selector and query selector all. These used to be jQuery things. They had slightly different syntax in jQuery, but JavaScript added them in, so you no longer need jQuery for this. So again, most of the functionality that was nice about jQuery is just built into JavaScript. So if you see jQuery, avoid it. It's not something you want to dive into. If you're working in a code base that's using jQuery, as long as you're comfortable with DOM manipulation, you could learn it in a day easily enough. You just jump on YouTube, watch a couple videos, and you'll know exactly what you're doing. All right, so our response here was this element remove method. It's just showing it as here it is, element.remove. So that means we take our element.remove and it just removes it from the DOM. Pretty straightforward. That just means we need to be able to select the element. Here they're doing a get element by ID. So it's selecting the second one. They're doing the second of the remove on that element, and then it deletes it. So that's what we'll do. The element we want to remove is the last list item. So we have our list available here in global scope. So this is what I'm going to be accessing. It's this node list. So we'll do list items at index to be removed dot remove, just like that. So we're selecting the last item because we're using the length of the list -1, and then we're putting the remove on it. Does anyone have any questions about how I came to this solution? This probably isn't the only solution. If you were to do some searching, you'd probably find 30 different other ways to do this. This is just one way. There's not one right way. There's many right ways. So if you find another way to do this and you're using it in your assignment, that's perfectly fine. As long as the functionality is there, that's great. So let's make sure it works. We're going to add an item, and now we're going to remove an item. And it looks like it's not working. That's because our node list isn't updated. It removed the last item whenever we only had 4 items. So we need to actually re-access that node list again. We'll need to reselect it. So I'm glad I tested that and didn't just trust that it would go to work. Always want to test your code to make sure that your solution's correct. So again, we need to re-grab this list items here. So what we can do is just go up here, copy it, and then paste it right here. And because this is inside of a function, it's not going to have any errors. It's inside of its own scope. So this will look for the closest one first. Again, we're wrapped inside of curly brackets. So I can have the same variable name here twice. So let's just make sure that's working correctly now. So I create an item. Now I remove an item, remove an item, and I can create and remove. And we still get our black background, and I can remove those. Does anyone have any questions about that? So let me show that code again. I'm selecting the items again here. And again, this works because I'm inside of this function scope. If this were in global scope, this would not work. If I were to move this up one line, I'm going to get an error because this is, and you can actually see my linters yelling at me, cannot redeclare block scope variable list items. So block scope is the same thing as saying global scope. I put it inside of a function. It's now local scope to this function, and it works fine. If you're ever concerned about this type of behavior, you could also give this a different name. You could say LIs like this. And then you have to change it here and here. And that might be a little better for some people. If they're reading your code, they might not see this line. They might think that you're actually accessing this up here, and they might think there's a bug baked in your code. So using two different names isn't a bad behavior. It doesn't actually matter. It comes down to who you're working with and what they consider acceptable. So just one of those things to keep in mind. There are more than one way to do this. Are there any questions about this so far? Again, we have our event listener. And just to kind of recap, we're grabbing this off of an array of buttons, more specifically a node list of buttons. We're using indexing to get each element out of there. And again, if I look at my console.log from line 23, look at line 23, we see that node list. We can see each button there with a class of BTN. So we selected the first button by doing index of 0. We select the second button by doing index of 1. If we wanted to add an event listener to the third button, we could do the index of 2. If I were going to be adding an event listener to all three of these at once, if the event listener was the same, then I could do this inside of a for loop, and I would do the index of I inside of that for loop, similar to up here when I added the black background. Right here. So I'm using the index of I as I looped over this entire list. So very similar behavior, but not exactly the same. Are there any questions? What questions do you have at this time? All right, so I'm going to go into the next section of our demo here. I've grabbed some images off of Unsplash. I'm just going to drag those into my folder here. I pre-did this just for the time's sake. They're just random images. It doesn't matter. If you are following along and need images and you already have some saved locally, you can do this with your own images, or you can grab some off Unsplash as well. Let me see if I can move these into here. If it's going to let me. I'd have to open this up. Letting me transfer those like that. I do have these in another location saved. Let me grab that quickly. I apologize. I was just trying to save a little time with these images because it does take a while to download them and rename them. I'm using this weird .avif extension. And again, these are just random images off of Unsplash. This was the file extension it gave me. I'm not familiar with it. If you find .pngs, it works the same way. So don't pay any attention to the file extension unless your Unsplash images are also .avif or whatever that is. And if anyone is familiar with that, I'd be curious to hear your insights on it. That's the first I've ever seen that extension. Okay, so let me add some stuff to my HTML now. I'm going to add, we'll go under the buttons here for this. I'm just going to add an H1 here. And I'll give this a class title. And I'm going to give this some text. I'm going to be changing this text through DOM manipulation. So there's the original text or the original title. And again, I have a class of title so that I can latch onto it. And I'm also going to throw this image in here. We'll do image. The SRC will be placeholder logo. And I'm going to give this a class of, I'm actually going to bring in Bootstrap for this. I'll do a W50, just so I don't have to set up all the sizing and stuff like that. Let me run to Bootstrap and grab the links. So there's my link to the CSS. Throw this into the head. And I'll throw the JavaScript at the bottom here. I don't plan on using any JavaScript. I'm just going to throw it in for the sake of completion. Okay, so W50 should give me a decent width on that, so it's not taking up the whole screen. Yep. So there's the image. And so what I want to do now is first I'm going to select that title and change it using DOM manipulation. So I'm going to create, let me bring it up again. So here's the original title. I'll get that nice serif font. All right, so we'll do const title equals document dot query selector. And I'm going to select this by the class name. And I'm just going to change the inner text. We've seen this before. I'm just trying to get you familiar with all this, modifying this. So the inner text is a property. It's like an attribute that lives on the HTML element. And it's basically the text that's in between the element, the opening and closing tag. So there's the updated title. Let's watch that change. There we have updated title instead of original title. So we can see that's working. And I'm also going to change an attribute to a different attribute, just to kind of show you how you could change out images on the fly using JavaScript. You might find that useful. So to do that, I'm going to select the image, which I don't think I gave that an ID, did I? I did not. Let me give this an ID of logo. I could have selected this just by image, but I'm going to be having other ones. So I'm just going to give this an ID so that I know which one I'm grabbing. So const, I'll call this logo just because that's the name of my ID, document.query selector. And we're going to pass in the ID of logo. And again, because I'm using query selector, I use the CSS selectors here. So I use the hashtag here and the dot notation here. Remember, classes have a period, IDs have a number. That's how you remember which symbol to use in front of each one. And to change the SRC, there's a couple ways we can do it. We could do logo.src equals. That isn't the way I'm going to do it because I want to show you this method that is actually for modifying current attributes. Oh, we have a question. Yes, Ryan.
Yeah, would you mind showing the HTML code for the first bit that you did where you updated the title?
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
the HTML code for putting in the image and all that?
Yeah, so that bit's right here.
Okay, give me just a second. Let me copy that down.
Yeah, no problem. So we gave it a class of title for the selector, and the image has an ID of logo for its selector. And on my image, I gave it this class of W-50. This is for the Bootstrap selector. Bootstrap will use 50% of the container width whenever you put W50 on it. That's just so it's not taking up 80% of my screen, or I guess 180% of my screen, because this image would be huge. And you don't have to use the same names as long as you're able to use an SRC if you're following along there. In fact, you could do this with the links from Unsplash if you didn't want to download them. I'm doing it locally just so to make these short and easier to understand.
All right, I'm just copying all the attributes down real quick.
Okay.
I'll go class W50. Sorry, bear with me.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. All right, so again, I changed the title here by selecting it by the class. I grabbed its inner text, updated the title. Now I want to change the SRC on this image. And again, I could do this with logo.src equals, but I want to show you this method because it's a little bit more powerful. It lets you select things and gives you a little bit more control over it. So what it would do is I would say logo dot set attribute. This is the name of the method. So again, this is like a function. So I'm going to put my parentheses here to invoke it. And it takes two parameters. The parameters are strings. So for the first parameter, I'm going to say src is the attribute we're setting. And we're going to set this to, I'm going to set it to this image right here, this desert looking thing. So currently we have 2 glasses of wine. And then we're going to actually change this over to be this desert. So the first parameter is my src. That's what I'm selecting. The second parameter is also a string, and that will be what we're actually setting it to. So I'm going to set my src to new logo.avif. So let's see if that changes to a desert. And there it is. I was able to update the image. This could be useful inside of event listeners. You could have it so like if the user scrolls down the page, and then when they scroll back up, you could have it change all the images. You could do some weird stuff like that. You could put it on a timer so that it changes the images on a timer, almost like a carousel type thing. You could do it for animation purposes. There's a lot of reasons you might want to change the images. Another one could be as well that maybe you want to use a smaller image if they're on a mobile device. So it doesn't have to load. It doesn't have to use as much data. So you could link this to, you could first check, is the user on mobile? If they are, then load the smaller image through JavaScript. So you could do something like that. You could also make it so when they click on the image, it changes to a new image. Maybe that's useful if you're creating some sort of card game. You could have it show a picture of a back of a card. They click on the card, it switches this src to be the front of the card, and you could create some sort of like poker game or whatever you're working on. You can have them flip the cards over by clicking on them. So something to keep in mind with that. Now I'm going to get into styling with JavaScript a little bit more. So let me go back into my HTML. I'm just going to add a couple paragraph elements here. I'll put those underneath the image, I guess. We'll do first paragraph. Second paragraph. And what I'm going to do here is I want to select the paragraph using query selector. And I just want to show you the behavior of this whenever you have more than one element with the same selector. So I'm going to change my background color of this first paragraph. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create in my head, I'm going to create a script tag. I'm going to use internal styling rather than inline styling. I'm going to say script. I'm going to create a class called highlight. You could call these classes whatever you wanted for this. Oops, sorry, I'd use script. That's not correct. I need to use style. In the script tag, you write JavaScript. In the style, you write CSS. So what I'm going to do is highlight. And I'm just going to change the background color. Actually, I'm going to change the font color. We'll call this change color, just so the class kind of represents it. So we're going to change the actual color to red. We'll go like a dark red. There we go. So I'm not actually applying this to anything yet. What I'm going to do is use my query selector, and then I'm going to add the class to it through JavaScript. We already kind of went over using inline styling here, so I'm going to use class styling now. So what I'm going to do is const P equals document dot query selector, and I'm going to pass in the string P. So because I'm just passing in this P, it's going to select the element paragraph. Now, this isn't the best variable name because this doesn't describe which paragraph I'm selecting. I'm actually going to rename this the first paragraph because it's only going to grab the first item it sees. And I'm going to demonstrate that by adding this class. We're going to do first paragraph dot class list equals, and we're just going to pass in, sorry, what was the name of that class? Change color or something? Change color. There we go. Let's take a look at that. Oh, did I say class list? Class name. Class list is a different one. Oh, we didn't get the result on that either. Let me actually just use the method. I'm not sure. Maybe it's just class. No, that doesn't exist. Yeah, I'm just going to use the method. It's class list dot add. Oh, you know what? Did I spell it wrong? No, I copied and pasted it in. And because this is a method, we'll put that in parentheses. No, it doesn't get a dot. It adds it directly.
Okay.
Yeah, you just put in the string name. That should have worked with the class name. I'm not sure what happened there. Unless I have a typo. I don't see a typo. Just should be change color. Yeah, so something's wrong here. Let me actually select that. Do I have another paragraph maybe in here? Oh, I don't. I'm going to do a console.log of first paragraph. So here it is. It actually has the class on it. Oh, main content. So this is what's being selected. It has the change color class, but let me check. Change color. Let's make this something a little more dramatic. We'll go neon green. Where is that paragraph at? Main content. Where are you at main content? There it is. Make this a div. Okay, so it is changing. It's just hard to see. Why is it hard to see? I just chose a bad color. I apologize. Let me go yellow, I guess. Just type it in. I'm the worst at colors, I swear. All right, there we go. We can really see that now. So again, it only selected the first paragraph because query selector, whenever it's looking for an element, and that's why we had the main content selected earlier. This wasn't the behavior I was looking for. Query selector looks for the first element that matches, and then it stops. Query selector all will grab all of them. So if I were to use query selector all, I could change all of the elements like that. I would have to loop over it to make it work. But that does work. And I apologize about the main content thing there. I forgot I put a paragraph in there to make that a block element. But that works now. So yeah, I just wanted to show you how that query selector behavior, what that looks like there. So I'm going to create a div. I'm going to give it an ID of message box. The content message box. And I'm Put this inside of a paragraph element. Or actually, I'll put it in an H2. There we go. We've got our message box. Let's go ahead and start selecting const message box equals document dot query selector. I'm going to pass in that ID. And the only time you use the dot and the hashtag is with query selector and query selector all inside your JavaScript. Message box. And I'm going to try that class name thing again. I just want to make sure that was class name equals. And I'm going to give it the class of highlight. Let's just see if that applied. Yes, it did. Okay. So it was working before. It was just a color choice I used wasn't working. I don't have anything yet for that, but I'm going to go ahead and give it a class of highlight. And we're going to change the background color to brown. And there we go. So there's both ways you can use to change your classes. My preferred method is using the class list dot add method. But if you prefer to use class name equals, this works fine as well. I believe you could put more than one on here. Let's see, change color like that, space separated. Yes, that works. We got our yellow there. So if you wanted to add more than one at once, you can use class name and then space separate them like this. Because this is the same as adding the attributes directly in your HTML, because we're selecting the class attribute. The reason this is class name and not just class is because in JavaScript, class is a keyword. It's already used for something important. It's kind of like sort of like a function that creates objects in JavaScript. So you would do something like this. That's an actual thing in JavaScript. So they made this class name just to make it clear that this isn't talking about this kind of class. Just so that you understand that difference there. Does anyone have any questions? All right, let's go ahead and take our 10-minute break, and then I'll show you a few more before we get into the assignment. I feel like this assignment might take a little bit longer today. It pretty much goes over everything I've showed here, except it's going to be a little bit more in depth. It might be a little bit more challenging, so you may need to ask questions during that. Let's get our 10-minute break in, and then we'll finish up this and get right into the assignment. So 10-minute timer, and I'll see you in 10. All right, welcome back, everyone. So I'm just going to dive right back into this again. That way we can maximize the amount of time we have to work on our assignment today. Next thing I want to add here is, let me look at my HTML. Let's see what we have. Our main content, we have our message box. I think I'm going to create one more element here. I'm actually going to show, I want to show you that, remember with Bootstrap, everything is class-based. So you can add Bootstrap components through JavaScript just by adding their class names. So if I wanted to add, say, the Bootstrap alert, if you remember what that looks like. Whoops, started writing the JavaScript in my HTML. So I'm just going to create a div. I'm going to give it an ID to latch onto. And this is going to be for like the Bootstrap alert component. So I'll do Bootstrap dash alert. Or this is kind of like a just a highlighted zone of text. You could use this for if you were changing a password, it would pop up saying password successfully changed, that type of thing. It'll probably come back as soon as you see what it looks like again. Let's see here. So I'm going to select this element by ID. I'll just do the classic get element by ID. Let's say alert equals document dot get element by ID. And then we'll pass in the ID Bootstrap alert. Remember, I'm not using the hashtag here because I'm not using the query selector. I'm using the get element by ID. So it's a little bit different syntax. One thing to keep in mind if you're doing a real world project, probably stick to one. Don't switch back and forth between the two like this. I'm just doing this for demonstration purposes. So all we have to do to make this a Bootstrap component is just give it a class name that's within Bootstrap. Since I already have Bootstrap imported, this will work right out of the gate. So we'll say alert dot class list dot add, and we'll do alert. Whenever using the method, each element you're adding is comma separated. So it's a little bit different than the class list, but it works the same way essentially. There's 2 C's in success. So this will give it that green background color, and this just gives it the base alert styling. So let's actually, I want console.log the class list out just so we can see that. We'll just put a message in here, Bootstrap classes added, and Bootstrap, that was called alert class list, just so we can see what that looks like in the console. Okay, let's take a look at our page. And here's the green message area that I was talking about. Gives it that little bit of nice coloring there. You would use this for like a success message after you're performing an action. And then in the console, here it is, the class list. We see the first class is alert. The second class is alert success. Anyone have any questions about that? Okay, I'm going to move forward then. I'm actually going to create another image here. We got that last image to use. Put that into my index. And what I want to do is make it so we could put like a mouse over on it. So it's a little bit different event listener, just so we're not seeing click all the time. So const image. Oh, sorry, I'm in my HTML. I can do that again. We're going to do image src placeholder image. And I'll give it an ID to latch onto because we already have an image. I could use query selector all and grab the next one through indexing, but this is just a little bit more verbose and a little bit easier to understand what's happening. And I'm also going to give this the W50 just so that it's not taking up the whole screen. And you know, I'm actually going to do that through JavaScript. Okay, so through JavaScript, I'm going to access that image now. So const image equals document dot query selector. And we gave it an ID of, what did we give it? Cover image. Hashtag hover image. And we're going to add an event listener. Actually, I'm going to add the class first, image dot class list dot add. And we'll call this one W50. So let's take a look. There it is. And next, I'm going to add my event listener. So again, I'm not going to use the click. That was getting boring. We're going to use the mouse over event. This is like a hover. I always call it hover, but it's actually mouse over. And we'll use the arrow function. And on hover, there's a few things we could do to this. I'm going to try to use scale. Let's see what we can do with scale. Image dot style dot scale equals 2. So when I hover it, it gets big. Once it gets big, it stays big because that style is applied inline and it won't remove it. I could create another event listener to where I'm no longer hovering it or mousing over it. And I could use that to scale it back down to 1. But just to see that again, it's working. I'm not clicking or anything. It's just on the mouse over. It does that. So it could be some use there. But again, we'd have to add a little bit more logic if we wanted to shrink it back down each time. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right, so the last thing I want to go over is the forms. Forms in HTML. These are really common to run into. So understanding how this works is going to be essential whenever you're building anything that has a form in it, which most websites do have a form in one place or another. What's happening here? I'm in my HTML. So it's form. And I'm not going to put an action on this, but I am going to give it an ID of sign up form. And then I'm going to put some content in here. I'll make this a login form. So we'll do a label. And then inside my label, I'm going to place an input for text. And this will be username. And this will say username. It'll be label. The reason I'm deleting the for attribute, actually I'll leave it in this one to show you the difference, is because I made my label a self-closer. If I don't make the label a self-closer, I do it like this, then actually I think it has to be a regular label. Yeah. I put my text in here. This would be password. And then underneath, I put my input like that. And then I'll say password and password. And then this for is going to say password so that it knows which input If you have it nested inside like this, you don't have to have the for attribute. If you do have it nested inside or don't have it nested inside, then you put your label here and tell it which input element it's for, and it wires these together. So when I click on this label, it will actually select this input element. So let's make sure that's working correctly. I click on password, it selects it. And if I click on the text, oh, I hovered that image. And if I click on username, it selects it. Alrighty. So I'm going to add a little bit of JavaScript here now for this. I'm actually going to put this back to 1 so it doesn't pop up on me like that. Let me select my sign up form. Equals document dot query selector. Select this by ID. And once it's selected, we can add our event listener. And this one's going to be a different one too. This is the submit event. Add event listener. So it's going to need a button in it. And the event's called submit. And I want to show you what happens whenever you submit a form without putting in this logic. For now, I'm just going to say console.log submit. And we're not actually going to see this happen. And I'll show you why here in a second. Let me go back in and put a button so we can submit it. And I'll give this a class of btn btn-primary. All right, so put in my username and password. Oh, I didn't make that a password element. Let me do that real quick. Try that again. There we go. And I'm going to press submit and watch my console for that console.log to pop up. And it was there for a second and then it refreshed. So this is the default behavior of a form. Whenever you put anything in here and you press submit, I seen the word submit there for a second. And then I don't know if you could see that because of the delay. It was there for a split second and then it was gone. Because my page is refreshing every time I click submit it. Watch the up here. You'll see that actually refreshes. So again, that's the default behavior of a form. If this wasn't in the form element, it wouldn't do that. But that would be bad practice for a form. So we want it to have its form behavior, but we want to disable it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass in the event object. So you'll type in the word event as a parameter in your function, and we'll say event dot prevent default. And that's a method that we're going to invoke right here. And let's go ahead and submit that again. And now we see the submit come up and the page doesn't refresh. So prevent default is a way to just prevent the default behavior of the browser. This isn't the only use case for event.prevent default. There's some other cases where there are default behaviors that happen, and you'll want to prevent those as well, such as whenever you're scrolling, the way it scrolls, sometimes you need to prevent that. There's a few other things. I can't think of them all off the top of my head, but if you ever run into an issue, you just Google the problem. And if you see event.prevent default, you'll know it's one of those issues. You'll also see this written as e.prevent default. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter what the parameter is called. You could call this banana.prevent default. As long as both of these are the same, it'll work the same. Because this is like a variable. It's a function parameter. Remember, when you declare a function, whatever's in these parentheses is passed in during the time that you invoke the function. So if I were to pass in num here and then console.log num, when I invoke the function, such as this, that's when num is going to be assigned, which I actually didn't pass a number in. There we go. So num is now 5, and it's getting passed in. I'm not passing anything in on this function. The add event listener method is passing that in for me. I don't have to do anything. It does it for me. So as long as I have something here, it'll pass it in. And whatever we call this, we get all of our methods and we get all of our information. Another thing you can use your event object for is actually getting the values of your form elements. So what I mean is, let's go ahead and console.log event dot, what would it be? Target dot value, maybe? Try that. So it says undefined. So it would be the form. Let me just do event.target. I might have to put the name of the elements in here. Yeah, so there's the form. So we'll do event.target.password. Okay, that is working. So there'd be dot value. You get a little bit of different behavior on different frameworks. That's why I can't really remember this off the top of my head sometimes. So sometimes a little trial and error goes a long way. So we'll do both of these. I will do password and username. And it's going off of the names of the functions. So if I type in hello and password is, we'll do a really secure password. Here we go. So we can see those come up in the console now. That's kind of how you would gather these to send them to your server. But you would want to make sure that if you were using some sort of logic like this, that you are at this point of the stage encrypting your data using built-in libraries to do that, and not just sending your username and password in the clear and plain text to your server to log in. That would be not best practice. That's something we'll get into more on level 3, developer level 3, how to do like that type of encryption and securement. But for now, this is good enough for what we're using it for. We could use this for like a sign-up form. We could use it for if you wanted to create some sort of application for if people wanted to join you for a 5K. You could get their information. You could get the values from the form that they're submitting. And then you could do something with that data, such as send it to a database, send it to an email server, whatever it is that you're planning on doing with the data. Does anyone have any questions? I want to share this side by side. Just where I'm getting that password and username from, because that is sometimes a little bit of a confusing topic. I did that backwards again. I always like to have my HTML on the left for some reason. It's just a thing I do. So in the form, the event.target is referring to all of this. The .username is referring to this, the name. So whatever you name these input fields, that's why the name property is important, by the way. Whatever you name these is how you access them. Without the .value, this gives you the entire element. If you were to do event.target.username, you could do something like this, which I don't know why you'd want to do this, but you could say event.target.username.add event listener. You could, if you wanted to, you could put a click event on this. You'd have to submit the form first for this to be applied. And then we would say clicked again, something like that. You could put an event listener on it. You could also change this value. You could clear it out on submit. You could make it so that the forms empty themselves. So if I put some text in here, notice these are still here. Whenever I clicked on that, we got her clicked again. So my event listener was added. Whenever you do the dot value, that's when it gives you what the text is. You might be able to do inner text. I'm not sure if that will work. Try it. I've never tried this before. We don't have any inner text apparently, so inner text doesn't work. We could do inner HTML, perhaps. I'm not even getting it as an autocomplete option. But we'll try it. And again, there's nothing there. So it's just a null field. Dot value is the only way then to get the actual values of what's typed in there currently. And there it is. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I'm going to bring up the assignment then. We can get started a little early on this today just because it's a little bit bigger assignment. I want to make sure we have enough time to get through it. All right, let's see. A4. I'm going to go ahead and edit this now since the formatting is messed up. Okay. So here it is. What we're going to do, we'll start with the objective here. So we want to demonstrate your proficiency in the DOM manipulation. This one will be a little bit challenging. I did cover everything in here, but I didn't cover it in the same order or in the same manner that it's written. So I want you to kind of, get a little bit more challenged with this. Kind of think outside the box a little bit and see if you could solve this. If you do get stuck for more than a few minutes, though, do ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for help on this. So our instructions are, first, we're going to create a repository as we normally do. We're using advanced DOM manipulation. Watch out for that period there at the end. I know, Omar, you had that issue earlier. I'm assuming that solved it, removing that period out of the name. Yeah, just be careful with that. Just grab the name and not the period. And you'll clone the repository to your machine, create an index in a JavaScript file. Next time, I'm actually going to probably edit these so that it doesn't have that period there, just so that doesn't happen again. Part 2 is your DOM selection and manipulation. So in the index.html, you're going to add a div with a container, a div container with an ID called main container. This is pretty similar to what I did. You're going to create button elements with the IDs button 1, button 2, button 3. You're going to create an empty UL with an ID called list container. So that'll just be a blank UL. The one I created in the demo had LIs in it. Yours won't have those LIs. And then I want you to use the get element by ID to select the main container and the list container. You'll use query selector all to select all the buttons. And when button 1 is clicked, add a new LI to the list container. Remember, the list container is your UL. And you want to put an inner text on that of new item. When button 2 is clicked, change the text of all the LI items to be update item. So that one you'll have to think about how you'll select all of the LIs again whenever you click this button. Button 3 will remove the last item from the list container. I did go over how to remove the last item from a list container earlier. So hopefully that's fresh in your mind still. If not, and you're getting stuck on it, don't worry about it. Just ask for help, and I can give you a refresh on that. But try to see if you could solve these two. Thinking will help you to understand this more. And then styling elements with JavaScript. So apply a border and padding to the main container using inline styles. That would be the style attribute that you'll use. That'll be element.style.property name equals, and then whatever the value is. So element.style.border equals, and you could do something like solid space 1 pixel space black, and that would give you that border. It's the same way you would write it in CSS or in inline styling. Padding, you could say element.style.padding equals, and then put in like 20 pixels or whatever value you want to place in there for that. And then create a CSS class called highlight. So this is something I did in class today. And you're going to do this inside of a style tag. I notice we're not using any CSS files in this one. Just to kind of remind you how to do the inline styling. And that CSS highlight tag should change the background color of the elements that it's applied to. And then when any LI item in the list container is clicked, toggle the highlight class for that item. Event listener implementation. You're going to attach event listeners to the buttons and perform the above actions. So this is basically everything we're talking about above. This is the same instructions here. So whenever you're going through these instructions, just do this piece by piece. Don't look at the whole project. Look at whatever step you're currently on and just keep chipping away at it until it's complete. That's the best way to handle this. Event handling. Ensure that the page responds to user actions as described above, and then implement functionality so that new LI items also have the click event listener attached to the highlight class to toggle. So remember I ran into that bug where I clicked the new item and it didn't have that, and I had to go in and add it separately. So there's a hint of something you might run into. And when you're done with all that, just ACP your work and push it up and submit it. Does anyone have any questions?
Not yet, but I know they're coming.
Yeah, and I do expect questions today. This is a lot of stuff, really, and it's a big assignment. So I'm going to get the breakout room started so you can get working, and then as soon as you have a question, just reach out immediately. If you think you can solve it, go for it, but don't work on it too long because we don't have a whole lot of time for our lab time here. We want to make sure that we're using the help as we have it. But if you do run out of time and you have to work on this tomorrow, utilize TAs. Make sure you reach out for help. And let me get these breakout rooms going. All right, opening the rooms. Let me shut the recording off.